You slowly learned to mistake silence for wisdom. You came to believe that making yourself smaller was the same as being humble. Without realizing it, you trained yourself to take up less space than your soul was meant to occupy. Little by little, pleasing other people stopped being a simple habit and became a strategy for survival inside your relationships. Carl Jung believed that one of the greatest tragedies of human life is that a person can become so identified with the role they play that they completely forget the living reality hidden beneath it. The most unsettling part is that this transformation rarely happens all at once. It unfolds so gradually that almost no one notices the exact moment they stopped living from their own center and began performing a carefully crafted version of themselves for the world. It begins with the smallest compromises. You surrender one decision because you do not want to create conflict. You remain silent about an opinion because disappointing someone feels unbearable. You ignore your intuition because everyone around you seems to expect something different. At first, these moments appear harmless. They seem like signs of maturity, kindness, or emotional intelligence. Yet over time, those repeated acts of self-denial stop feeling like choices. They become your identity. Jung often explained that every unconscious decision slowly shapes the personality. The more often you abandon your authentic reactions, the more unfamiliar your true nature becomes. There is a profound difference between being accepted and being genuinely known. Countless people receive admiration because they carefully hide what they truly think, truly feel, and truly desire. They become experts at presenting an acceptable personality to the world. Jung called this the persona, the social mask that allows us to function within society. The persona is not evil, it has a purpose. It helps us navigate social life, but the danger appears when the mask becomes more important than the face beneath it. When that happens, people no longer know whether they are living their own life or merely protecting the image they have created. Many spend years receiving compliments for a version of themselves that was designed to avoid rejection. They are praised for being agreeable, dependable, patient, accommodating, and endlessly understanding. Yet the person they truly are remains hidden in silence, waiting for the day when it can finally exist without apologizing for its existence. Deep inside, something continues, whispering that none of the praise feels entirely real because it is directed toward a character rather than toward the authentic self. This explains why so many people experience a strange emptiness that no achievement seems capable of filling. From the outside, everything appears successful. They worked hard. They avoided unnecessary mistakes. They maintained peace within their families. They protected friendships. They fulfilled responsibilities. They met expectations. They became exactly the kind of person everyone admired. Yet when they are finally alone with themselves, an uncomfortable feeling quietly emerges. It feels as though someone else has been living their life while the real person has remained locked behind an invisible door. Jung understood this inner conflict as the painful separation between the conscious personality and the deeper self. The self is not the image you project. It is not your reputation, your accomplishments, or your social identity. It is the totality of who you truly are, including the parts you have accepted and the parts you have spent years denying. Whenever the distance between the persona and the self grows too large, the soul begins to suffer. Anxiety appears without obvious reason. Success loses its flavor. Relationships begin to feel strangely empty. Life itself starts feeling disconnected, not because something is missing outside of you, but because something essential has been abandoned within you. The human mind possesses an extraordinary ability to disguise survival mechanisms as personality traits. Fear begins calling itself caution. Emotional dependence is renamed loyalty. The inability to establish healthy boundaries becomes kindness. Constant self-sacrifice is celebrated as generosity. Perfectionism disguises itself as responsibility. Chronic people-pleasing is mistaken for compassion. Jung repeatedly warned that what remains unconscious eventually governs our lives. We believe we are making free decisions, while in reality many of our behaviors are simply old defense mechanisms continuing to operate long after the original danger has disappeared. Over the years, these defenses become so familiar that they no longer feel like protection. They simply feel like who you are. But they are not who you are. They are the psychological armor you developed while trying to avoid pain. Every child naturally learns which behaviors receive love and which behaviors receive rejection. If authenticity repeatedly led to criticism, punishment, ridicule, or abandonment, the unconscious quickly reached a simple conclusion: hide your real self if you want to remain safe. That conclusion may have protected you once, but what protects a child can imprison an adult. The most fascinating part is that this invisible prison is usually admired by society. People applaud the individual who never creates discomfort. They praise the one who always agrees. They reward those who sacrifice themselves without complaint. They celebrate endless availability, constant accommodation, and emotional silence. Without realizing it, you begin maintaining your own prison because the rewards feel comforting. Every compliment becomes another reason to remain disconnected from yourself. Every approval reinforces the belief that disappearing is the price of belonging. Jung observed that societies naturally encourage conformity because conformity creates stability. Yet psychological growth requires something entirely different. Individuation. The central process of Jungian psychology is the lifelong journey of becoming the person you were always meant to become, rather than the person everyone else expected you to be. Individuation is not selfishness. It is not rebellion for its own sake. It is the courageous process of recovering the parts of yourself that were abandoned in exchange for acceptance. Real confidence does not begin when every doubt disappears. It begins the moment you recognize that many of your doubts never truly belonged to you. They were inherited. They came from family expectations, cultural beliefs, painful experiences, and relationships that silently taught you one lesson over and over again. Showing your authentic self might cost you love, belonging, or approval. Some people learned this lesson through criticism. Others learned it through emotional neglect. Some discovered it because every mistake was punished. Others because affection was offered only when they behaved exactly as expected. Whatever the circumstances, the unconscious absorbed a powerful message. Authenticity became associated with danger. Eventually, you became afraid of your own voice because there was a time when that voice was interrupted, corrected, ignored, laughed at, or dismissed. You became cautious about expressing your needs because those needs once seemed inconvenient to someone else. You learned to hide your emotions because vulnerability once resulted in disappointment. Without consciously deciding, you concluded that fitting in was safer than revealing yourself. This decision is rarely made in adulthood. It is made long before we possess the maturity to question it. The child simply adapts. Adaptation ensures survival. But years later, the adult continues, following rules that were written by a frightened younger version of themselves. According to Jung, the unconscious never forgets these early adaptations. They continue influencing every important decision until they are brought into awareness. That is why so many people spend their entire lives searching for confidence, when the real problem is something far deeper. They did not lose confidence first. They lost permission to be themselves. That realization can be deeply uncomfortable because it forces a question that cannot easily be avoided. How many of the decisions you proudly call your own were actually made to avoid someone else's rejection? Take a moment with that question. Do not rush toward an answer. The unconscious rarely responds immediately. It protects itself with comforting explanations. It tells you that you were simply being responsible, that you were only trying to keep the peace, that you were acting out of love. Sometimes those explanations are true, but sometimes they are merely sophisticated disguises hiding an old fear that has quietly directed your entire life. Most people assume they lack confidence because they feel afraid before making important decisions. Yet fear is rarely the original problem. Fear is often just the final symptom. The true beginning came much earlier, during the years when you slowly learned that being accepted depended on your ability to become what other people wanted you to be. From that moment forward, an invisible shift occurred inside your mind. You stopped asking yourself, "What do I truly want?" and began asking, "What will make them accept me?" The difference seems almost insignificant. It feels like a tiny adjustment in perspective. Yet that single shift changes the entire architecture of identity. Instead of building a life from your inner truth, you begin constructing it around external expectations. Instead of listening to the quiet voice emerging from the depths of your own psyche, you become increasingly dependent on the applause, approval, and reassurance of those around you. Jung believed that every individual carries within them a unique psychological blueprint waiting to unfold. No one else can live that destiny for you. No amount of external validation can replace the peace that comes from living in harmony with your authentic nature. The farther you drift from that inner blueprint, the louder your unconscious begins calling you back. Sometimes it speaks through anxiety, sometimes through depression, sometimes through unexplained dissatisfaction, sometimes through recurring dreams, powerful emotions, or the persistent feeling that something essential is missing despite every visible success. These experiences are not signs that you are broken. They are invitations from the deeper self, asking you to stop abandoning who you are. The psyche constantly seeks wholeness. It continually pushes us toward integration, even when the conscious mind resists the journey. Every uncomfortable emotion may contain a message pointing toward the forgotten parts of yourself that are asking to be recognized. What comes after this realization is what very few people are willing to examine honestly. Looking deeply into these hidden patterns requires courage because it means questioning beliefs that have shaped your entire identity. It means recognizing that many of the choices you considered completely free may have been guided by invisible fears planted long before you understood what they were. To truly see this with clarity, however, you must travel much farther back than most people ever dare. You must return to a time long before you were old enough to make conscious decisions, long before you understood approval, rejection, success, or failure. Because the story of the person you became did not begin when you started making choices as an adult. It began in the silent moments of childhood, where your unconscious was learning what it believed it needed to become in order to deserve love, safety, and acceptance. From childhood, we learn that certain behaviors are rewarded. People smile when we obey, hug us when we don't create problems, and praise us when we fit the image they expected us to become. At the same time, we discover that having a different opinion, expressing strong emotions, or making unexpected choices often leads to the opposite. A disapproving look, harsh words, or a painful silence. A child's mind doesn't carefully analyze these experiences. It simply stores them as survival lessons. If you want to be loved, it's safer to hide certain parts of yourself. What most people never realize is what happens when that child grows up. The lesson doesn't disappear. It simply becomes quiet. It turns into such an automatic habit that it feels as natural as breathing. Before speaking your mind, you wonder how others will react. Before setting a boundary, you think about who might be upset. Before starting something new, you look for permission disguised as advice, hoping someone will reassure you that you're allowed to try. Without realizing it, your confidence stops coming from your own beliefs and starts depending on other people's reactions. This is where one of the most subtle traps appears. You believe you're making independent choices, when in reality, many of them are still controlled by the fear of being disliked. From the outside, your life seems to move forward. You change jobs, cities, or relationships, yet deep inside, you remain in the same place, still asking for permission to be who you truly are. It's like moving into a different room while never leaving the same house. Carl Jung observed something that helps explain this. He believed that every person develops a kind of mask to live peacefully with others, a socially acceptable face presented to the world. There is nothing wrong with that adaptation by itself. Everyone needs it to some degree. The danger begins when the mask stops being a tool and starts controlling your entire life. Eventually, you can no longer tell the difference between what you genuinely want and what you do simply to avoid losing other people's approval. You spend your life maintaining a version of yourself that keeps everyone comfortable while your true feelings remain hidden in the background, waiting to be acknowledged. Maybe that's why so many people carry a deep exhaustion they can't explain. It's not only the weight of work or responsibilities, it's the invisible effort of playing a role every day, constantly pleasing others, trying not to disappoint anyone. Imagine the energy it takes to pretend you're fine for years. No one can see that effort, but it slowly drains you from within, little by little. And it's important to make one thing clear, because people often confuse it. Real self-confidence doesn't appear when everyone finally approves of your choices. That would still mean your worth depends on other people, only under better circumstances. Genuine confidence begins the moment you realize that your identity cannot remain attached to the permission of people who will never live with the consequences of your decisions. That realization arrives quietly, without applause. At first, it feels uncomfortable, but it marks the beginning of living as a real person instead of surviving behind a character. The problem is that after so many years, the character no longer feels like a mask. It feels like your real face, and that's where the most difficult part begins. Once something feels like your identity, you stop questioning it, and that leads to a consequence that very few people expect. Everything you keep hiding doesn't disappear. Many people believe suppressing something is the same as erasing it, but it isn't. What you silence simply finds another place inside you. The courage you never expressed slowly becomes regret. The anger you swallowed again and again turns into quiet resentment that you can't even identify. And the dreams you kept postponing become that feeling of emptiness that appears even when everything in your life seems perfectly fine. None of those parts truly disappeared. They simply moved into a darker corner of your mind, where they continue to weigh on you in silence. That's why something strange often happens. Sometimes you meet someone who lives freely, speaks honestly, and makes choices without asking for permission. Instead of feeling inspired, you experience an irritation you can't quite explain. What many people call envy is rarely envy in its purest form. Carl Jung would have suggested that what disturbs you so deeply is often a projection from your own unconscious. The discomfort you feel when someone else lives with authenticity is not necessarily resentment toward them. It is the painful recognition of a part of yourself that has remained abandoned for years. Every person who dares to speak honestly, who refuses to apologize for existing, who walks through life without constantly asking for permission, unconsciously reminds you of the freedom you sacrificed in exchange for acceptance. Their existence becomes a mirror, and mirrors are rarely comfortable when they reflect the truth we have spent years avoiding. The pain is not created by what they do, The pain comes from realizing what you stopped allowing yourself to become. Somewhere along the way, you exchanged your spontaneity for approval, your truth for safety, and your individuality for belonging. The fire you feel inside is not proof that something is wrong with them. It is evidence that your unconscious remembers a life you were always meant to live. Carl Jung believed that every human being carries within them a unique pattern of becoming. He called this journey individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you truly are, rather than who the world expects you to be. Yet, almost everyone abandons this path at some point. The desire to be accepted becomes stronger than the desire to be authentic. Slowly, without realizing it, you begin to betray yourself in small ways that eventually become the foundation of your entire identity. At the center of this process lies one of the most powerful psychological forces in human life, the fear of rejection. It is astonishing how much of human behavior is shaped by this invisible force. Yet it rarely arrives openly. It does not announce itself with dramatic emotions. Instead, it wears elegant disguises. It disguises itself as excessive kindness that never allows you to disappoint anyone. It becomes the inability to say no, even when your entire body is asking you to stop. It appears as the habit of over-explaining your choices, because deep inside you believe your existence requires constant justification. You begin apologizing for taking up space, apologizing for having needs, apologizing for being different. Eventually, you stop asking yourself what feels right. Instead, your life begins revolving around a much quieter question. How will people see me? That single question quietly becomes the architect of your entire existence. The tragedy is that society often rewards this prison. The person who never refuses a request is described as generous. The one who never argues is considered mature. The one who silently tolerates disrespect is praised for being patient and peaceful. From the outside, everything appears admirable. Inside, however, something sacred begins disappearing. Jung repeatedly warned that whenever we deny essential parts of ourselves, they do not vanish. They descend into the unconscious, where they become the shadow. The shadow is not evil. It is everything you have been taught you must not be. Your anger, your ambition, your creativity, your courage, your sexuality, your boundaries, your independence, your voice. Every time you silence one of these parts simply to remain accepted, the shadow grows stronger. The world applauds the mask, while the real self slowly fades into darkness. There is an enormous difference between choosing peace from wisdom and abandoning your dignity from fear. One is strength. The other is surrender disguised as kindness. There comes a moment when your longing for acceptance no longer connects you with people. Instead, it begins breaking you apart from within. You smile when your soul wants to leave. You agree when every instinct is screaming no. You remain in places that no longer nourish your spirit, because disappointing someone feels more frightening than disappointing yourself. You stay inside relationships where your voice no longer exists. You remain inside careers that slowly drain your life. You continue playing roles that no longer resemble the person you truly are, not because they make you happy, because they feel familiar. Carl Jung observed that the greatest privilege of life is becoming who you truly are, yet that privilege demands an uncomfortable price. It requires leaving behind every false identity that was built merely to survive. As long as your emotional peace depends on someone else's approval, your freedom does not belong to you. Your emotional state rises and falls according to compliments, criticism, recognition, silence, or rejection. A single unanswered message can ruin your entire day. A stranger's opinion suddenly becomes more important than your own intuition. Without realizing it, you have handed over the authority of your inner life to people who often barely know you. This is how psychological imprisonment begins. The most tragic part is that while you spend enormous energy protecting an acceptable image, the authentic personality hidden beneath that image receives less and less attention. Yet the authentic self never disappears completely. It waits, quietly, patiently. One day, it begins whispering instead of remaining silent. This awakening rarely comes through dramatic events. There is usually no life-changing speech, no miraculous opportunity, no sudden transformation. It often begins during an ordinary evening when you realize something impossible to ignore. You have spent years building a life that looks successful from the outside while feeling increasingly absent from your own existence. Everything appears in order. Yet something essential is missing, and suddenly you understand what it is. You, the person you were always meant to become, never disappeared. They simply stopped being consulted. From that realization begins perhaps the hardest psychological work a human being can undertake. You must slowly release every identity that once protected you. This requires compassion because those identities were not mistakes. They were survival strategies. Perhaps pleasing everyone protected you from conflict during childhood. Perhaps becoming invisible kept you emotionally safe. Perhaps saying yes to everything prevented abandonment. Perhaps perfection earned the love that otherwise seemed unavailable. Those adaptations served a purpose. They kept you alive. The problem is not that you developed them. The problem is believing they must remain forever. Carl Jung taught that psychological growth always demands sacrifice. But what must be sacrificed is never your authentic self. What must die are the false personalities created to survive environments that no longer exist. Continuing to live through outdated defenses is like an adult refusing to remove the training wheels from a bicycle. What once provided stability eventually prevents movement. Many people resist this transformation because they imagine they are only giving up a few unhealthy habits. In reality, they are saying goodbye to an entire identity. The dependable one, the invisible one, the people pleaser, the rescuer, the one who constantly proved their worth through sacrifice, the one who confused exhaustion with love. Letting go of these identities feels terrifying because for a period of time you stand between two worlds. The old self is dissolving. The new self has not fully emerged. This psychological space feels empty, uncertain, and lonely. Many people retreat here, not because they are weak, because uncertainty is uncomfortable. The unconscious naturally prefers familiar suffering over unfamiliar freedom. Jung understood this paradox deeply. The psyche often chooses what is known, even when it causes pain, because familiarity creates the illusion of safety. This explains why people repeatedly return to unhealthy relationships. Why they recreate the same emotional patterns. Why they choose environments that diminish them. Not because suffering feels good, because suffering they understand appears safer than freedom they have never experienced. The prison becomes home simply because they have lived there long enough. Yet every time you choose to act according to your deepest convictions instead of your deepest fears, something changes within you. Not dramatically, quietly. Almost invisibly. Your voice becomes clearer. Your boundaries become calmer. You stop explaining yourself endlessly. You discover something extraordinary. Someone can disagree with you, and your world does not collapse. Someone can misunderstand you, and you still remain whole. Someone can leave, and you survive. This realization transforms your relationship with yourself. The enormous energy once spent managing other people's opinions slowly becomes available for something infinitely more meaningful, building a life that actually reflects your soul. There is another truth that deserves attention. Authenticity does not eliminate fear. It transforms it. Before, your greatest fear was disappointing others. Now, another fear gradually replaces it. The fear of abandoning yourself again. This new fear is healthier because it protects your integrity instead of your image. Respect for yourself begins replacing dependence on approval. Your conscience becomes more important than applause. Your peace becomes more valuable than popularity. Gradually, you understand one of the most liberating psychological truths Carl Jung ever pointed toward. Remaining faithful to your deepest nature may cost you certain relationships. Remaining unfaithful to yourself costs your entire life. Everything changes after this realization. The central question is no longer who might reject you. Instead, another question quietly emerges. If no one on earth could judge you, if nobody could criticize you, if nobody could reward or punish your decisions, how differently would you choose to live beginning today? Stay with that question. Do not answer it too quickly, because hidden inside it is an astonishing revelation. It does not merely describe the person you hope to become, it reveals the person you abandoned in order to belong. There is also an important distinction that is often misunderstood. Appearing confident is not the same as possessing genuine inner confidence. Confidence that depends upon admiration disappears with criticism. Real confidence remains standing even when nobody agrees. Its foundation is not certainty about success. Its foundation is loyalty to oneself. It is the quiet decision that no amount of external love is worth the price of internal betrayal. For many years you may have believed failure was the greatest danger in life, so you carefully protected your image. You avoided mistakes. You tried to remain admirable, respectable, acceptable. But there is a danger far greater than failure. A danger so silent that millions never recognize it until much later. It is spending so many years fulfilling everyone else's expectations that when you finally look back, you discover you never truly met yourself. This loss rarely arrives all at once. It happens gradually. Every time you silence your intuition to avoid criticism, every time you settle for less than your soul deserves because loneliness feels frightening, every time you abandon your truth in exchange for temporary acceptance, none of these decisions destroys you overnight. Instead, they slowly wear away your vitality, your spontaneity, your imagination, your courage, until one day you find yourself living efficiently but no longer living fully. This is why individuation demands courage. The moment you begin respecting yourself, certain relationships inevitably change. People who benefited from your constant availability may suddenly call your boundaries selfish. Those who depended upon your insecurity may mistake your confidence for arrogance. Some will accuse you of changing, and they will be right. Because you are changing, not into someone artificial, into someone more real. Every transformation disturbs old balances. When you stop playing the familiar role, everyone around you must adjust. Some people celebrate your growth, others resist it. Their reaction is not always about you. Often it reflects the parts of themselves they have not yet accepted. Remember one of Jung's deepest psychological insights. What irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. The resistance people show toward your authenticity often reveals the conflict within their own unconscious. Believing in yourself was never about becoming superior. It was never about rejecting society. It was never about ignoring wisdom offered by others. It was simply recognizing that no meaningful life can be built exclusively upon external expectations. The affection of others can comfort you for a season. Only self-respect can sustain you for a lifetime. Perhaps true power was never found in speaking the loudest, never in winning every argument, never in constantly proving your value. Perhaps genuine power has always lived somewhere much quieter, in the silent ability to walk your own path with integrity, to recognize that your choices finally belong to you, to stop living as a reflection of other people's expectations. to stop apologizing for your existence. Carl Jung never promised a life without uncertainty. He never suggested that becoming yourself would eliminate fear. Instead, he showed that wholeness is born when we stop dividing ourselves in order to satisfy the world. To believe in yourself does not mean becoming fearless. It does not mean becoming invincible. It does not mean never experiencing doubt. It means refusing to abandon your own soul simply to secure temporary approval. Freedom is not born on the day everyone finally understands you. Freedom is born on the day their approval is no longer the force directing your life. And when that day quietly arrives, there is no standing ovation, no dramatic celebration, only a profound silence unlike any you have known before. A silence in which, perhaps, for the very first time, you can finally hear your own voice without the noise of expectations, without the weight of borrowed identities, without asking permission to exist, without apologizing for becoming exactly who you were always meant to be.